In this video, we'll be discussing associative learning. In particular, we'll focus on classical conditioning in this video. We'll identify the area of the brain that's important in learning the classical conditioning response, as well as identify the area of the brain that allows the classical conditioning behavioral response to occur. So when Pavlov identified and studied classical conditioning, he believed that there was a center in the brain for the conditioned stimulus, center in the brain for the unconditioned stimulus, and another one for the unconditioned response. While I refer to them as the UR and the US, Pavlov referred to them as the UCS or the UCR. So what he thought would happen is this was that natural reflexive connection, and he thought that by pairing that neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus over time, this connection was strengthened, thus allowing the CS to elicit the unconditioned response. And this again is associative learning. So in the previous video, you saw Richard Thompson's search for the engram. And the engram is a memory trace. This memory trace, or this engram, is a physical representation of what's been learned. And so while your book talks about how Lashley searched for this memory trace, or this engram, through the cortex and was unsuccessful, Thompson came along years later and looked more specifically in an area called the cerebellum. Richard Thompson's search for the engram suggested that for classical conditioning, the location of that memory trace was found in the cerebellum. And that was reviewed in the previous video, and you can see a refresher of that paradigm shown here. Again, reminding you where the cerebellum is, showing you that this lateral interpositive nucleus was identified as the location of where the learning occurred, and it's within the cerebellum. And in order to actually have the behavioral response, this red nucleus was needed. And we're going to walk through the research that demonstrated that. If you haven't already, please go ahead and pause the video and make sure that you have that handout handy. You're going to answer the questions on it as we go through the next part of the video, and then upload that for points. So this is the normal learning curve. So this is the percentage of a conditioned response, and this is the number of sessions. So the number of times where an animal's been trained to, with getting that puff of air, or having that tone followed by the puff of air, and then they measure that eye blink response. And so you'll see over time that conditioned response get higher and higher, and then eventually it flattens out. And so this is what's known as the normal learning curve. And it's normally got a little curve there. So one observation that the Thompson lab made was that changes occur in the lateral interpositive nucleus of the cerebellum. So the question was, is it responsible for the learning? So is it responsible for allowing this learning curve to happen, or just the behavioral response? So if they inhibited the lateral interpositive nucleus, so if they inhibited it with a drug so that the cells in that lateral interpositive nucleus, the lip, could no longer fire action potentials, they saw no eye blink responses. So that in itself doesn't answer, was it responsible for the learning or the response? And so that's what this graph is showing you here. These are the behavioral responses while the lateral interpositive nucleus is suppressed. Percentage of CRs, you see no eye blink response at all. Tone, followed by puff of air, no eye blink response. Tone, puff of air, followed by no eye blink response. So that's happening during each of these sessions. They're training them. And what you should see is this normal learning curve, and you see nothing. If you remove the inhibition, so once that inhibition is worn off and those cells in the lateral interpositive nucleus, or the lip, are allowed to fire action potentials, you provide the animal. So really this should be session 7, 8, 9, 10. So it's just a continuation. And we went through these 6 sessions with the lateral interpositive nucleus inhibited. That inhibition was removed or worn off. Now we're here 7, 8, 9, and 10. And what you see is that no learning has occurred. If learning has occurred, that behavioral response would be up here. What you see is a normal learning curve. So in session 1, tone, puff of air, and this is the behavioral response. Tone, puff of air, behavioral response, so on and so forth. So what you see is this normal learning curve, suggesting that the lateral interpositive nucleus is responsible for learning that behavioral response. Those results suggest again that the LIP, the lateral interpositive nucleus, is necessary for learning and retention of the eye blink response. So here's just a figure from your textbook, just kind of showing you all those results together. Now, another observation was that changes also occur in the red nucleus. So again, the question is it responsible also for learning, like we just saw with the lateral interpositive nucleus, or is it responsible for allowing the conditioned response to occur? So again, if you inhibit the red nucleus, you keep it from firing action potentials by injecting a drug, you don't see an eye blink response. So once again, here's our normal learning curve. While the red nucleus is suppressed, again, just like with the lateral interpositive nucleus, you don't see a conditioned response. Here we have a tone, puff of air, no eye blink, tone, puff of air, no blank, eye blink, and so on and so forth. However, once you remove that inhibition, the conditioned response occurs. So notice here, this is again, let's say session 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, animal recovers, now session 7, 8, 9, 10, no learning had to happen. All of a sudden, boom, the eye blink occurs, suggesting that the learning was occurring here. You just couldn't see that eye blink response. That suggests that the red nucleus is not needed for learning, because while the red nucleus was inhibited, learning occurred, but it is needed for that behavioral response, whether you're talking about the unconditioned response or the conditioned response, because they're basically the same. So again, this diagram's from your textbook, just again reminding you where the lateral interpositive nucleus is in the cerebellum, that red nucleus, and how it causes that behavioral response through controlling those cranial nerves. And we've already discussed all of these different graphs.